coming up with this idea. A few of their leaders reached out to Dr. Megan Wolff and I and said, do you think you could get Dr. Pete Myers, who is a co-author of the book Our Stolen Future, to do a webinar with all of us on endocrine disruptors? And I said, sure. And thankfully, Dr. Myers instantly got back and said yes. And that's what we'd like to do at Beyond Plastics. We want to welcome you to contact us with any good ideas you have. If they're a good idea, we'll put it in motion. If it's not a great idea, and sometimes they're not all great ideas, I will say to you, that's an idea, and that's code for we're not going to do it. But this idea was a wonderful one. So thank you to the League of Women Voters, and thanks to them for co-sponsoring this evening. I'm sorry to share with you that our second keynote speaker, Senator Pete Harckham, sends his apologies. He's not able to make it tonight. He just texted me, and he has a family medical emergency. And we really hope that that is okay and works out all right. He sends his apologies. I told him no apology was needed. We just hope it all works out. And we're happy that we're joined by his top staff person, Sylvie Sherlock, who is the legislative and committee director for Senator Harckham. And she'll be listening in tonight. And I'm sorry to say, I will be standing in for Senator Harckham to talk about the state bill. But I can hear people clicking off all over the country right now. Stay with us because you want to stay to hear Dr. Pete Myers. And then I will talk about the packaging reduction bill that's pending in New York, which has national significance. Before I turn this over to our colleague, Beth Radow, I just want to spend a moment sharing with you some truly terrible news we got yesterday. For those of us within the environmental community in New York, we lost a very dear friend and partner in environmental protection, our cherished friend, Ryan Carson, who is a key environmental staff person with the New York Public Interest Research Group, NYPIRG, died yesterday. Ryan was only 32. He is a shining light, accomplished so much at a young age. Beyond Plastics staff were in touch with him practically every day. And it was always a good day when you were in a meeting with Ryan. In fact, he was with us Saturday in a long Zoom meeting Saturday afternoon. We are all pretty broken about this. I thought, should we continue with this webinar? But we have to, because we have to keep doing this work. Ryan was a larger than life figure, so filled with joy and energy and compassion, and got so much done at a young age. Our condolences to his parents, to his partner, Claudia, who we've gotten to know, and really to our sisters and brothers that work at the New York Public Interest Research Group, NYPIRG. This is a devastating time for them. So please keep the family in your thoughts and your prayers. And we love Ryan, and we'll never forget him, and we will honor his work. Let me now turn it over to Beth Radow. Beth is an attorney in Westchester County with the Radow Law Firm. Radow, forgive me. Beth is the chairperson of the New York State League of Women Voters Committee on Energy, Agriculture, and the Environment. Thank you, Beth.
Thank you, Judith. On behalf of the League of Women Voters of New York State, welcome to this much needed discussion. Special thanks for this program go to Susan Schwartz and Camilla Calhoun. In its 100+ year history, the League has worked to protect democracy in the voting booth while also educating the public and lobbying for issues that it has studied and deemed essential to a thriving democratic republic. This includes the League's support for policy options discussed here today. The role of endocrine disrupting chemicals used in high volume hydraulic fracturing resonates with many listening today who a decade ago testified, lobbied, and otherwise advocated through the democratic process to protect our environment and our health. Theo Colborn was our North Star. Today, we renew the conversation involving plastics and welcome your voice to pass legislation that protects and preserves our environment and our health. We welcome our distinguished speakers. Dr. Pete Myers is recognized by the National Institutes of Health as a champion of environmental health research, among other accolades. As founder, CEO, and chief scientist of environmental health sciences, Dr. Myers has long been recognized as a giant in his field of endocrine disrupting chemicals. Little known fact, Pete Myers coined the term endocrine disruptors in 1991 at the wing spread workshop that he and Theo Colborn organized. And I wrote with Theo Colborn and Diane Dumanosky the groundbreaking book, Our Stolen Future, which explores the scientific basis of concern for how those bioaccumulating chemicals threaten fetal development and long-term health. Thankfully, Dr. Myers has been exploring ever since. Judith Enck founded Beyond Plastics in 2019 to end plastic pollution through education, advocacy, and institutional change. Passionate about protecting public health and the environment, Judith is also on the faculty at Bennington College. Judith grew up in a working class family in the Catskill Mountains and put herself through college. Since then, Judith has held top influential positions in state and federal government. Appointed by President Barack Obama, Judith served as the regional administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, overseeing environmental protection in New York, New Jersey, 8 Indian nations, Puerto Rico, and the US Virgin Islands, in addition to managing staff of 800 and a $700 million budget. Previously, Judith served as Deputy Secretary for the Environment in the New York State Governor's Office and Policy Advisor to the New York State Attorney General. She was Senior Environmental Associate with the New York Public Interest Research Group, served as Executive Director for Environmental Advocates of New York, and is a past president of the Hudson River Sloop Clearwater. In addition, Judith is a panelist on a public affairs radio show on a local NPR station, WAMC. Last December, both Pete Myers and Judith Enck testified side by side in front of the United States Senate Environment and Public Works Committee on plastics issues. Dr. Megan Wolff is the policy director at Beyond Plastics. Dr. Wolff's master's and doctorate in public health from Columbia University led her to Cornell Weill Medical College, where she developed a mental health policy initiative before joining Beyond Plastics. Megan Wolff believes that climate change is the greatest threat to health and well-being, and that our overproduction of plastics touches on every phase of the climate fight. Megan Wolff will be our moderator today. Megan?
Thank you so much, Beth. That was wonderful. So we're going to begin tonight by hearing from Dr. Myers, who will tell us much of what he knows in brief about endocrine disrupting chemicals and where they are in plastics. So Dr. Myers, go ahead.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure and honor to be here with you. Whenever Judith asks me to do something for Beyond Plastics, I do it because she is so effective as a leader. And so I was very pleased to be invited to do this. And I'm sorry that the senator will not be able to join us tonight. When you think about plastics, when most people think about plastics, they think it's a wonderful material. There's a dirty, dark secret behind that, though, and that is it's made up of lots of different chemicals. And if you look at all the chemicals that are used in all the plastics, it's well over 10,000 plastic chemicals. And that makes testing for safety a real problem. And so I'm going to address the question, why are plastics so threatening to health? And I'm going to share my screen. Does that have the title page up there?
No.
Oh, I know. I've got to hit share. How's that?
Good.
Okay. So why are plastics so threatening to health? Let's dig into this question, specifically to the issue of endocrine disrupting chemicals, or EDCs. They're not the whole story, but they are a key to understanding the relationships between plastics and health. To quote Shauna Swan's masterpiece book, published in 2020, Countdown, about endocrine disruption, and especially its contributions to the 5-decade-long sperm count decline that she has been studying seriously since the 1990s. Hormones are like the great and powerful Oz, behind the curtain, unseen but mighty. Hormones are master manipulators, given they influence virtually every cell in the body as well as various organs. Let me repeat that. Virtually every cell in the body as well as various organs. So they're important. They are what makes you, hormones are what makes you who you are. And I'm going to give one quick example and then go on to more details. In the first trimester of pregnancy, a fetal male produces a spike in its testosterone levels that sets in motion the full development of his reproductive tract. That begins in the first trimester. If something lowers the amount of testosterone, his reproductive tract will develop less masculine. He is more likely to have undescended testes at birth, a birth defect of the penis called hypospadias. And as an adult, he will have a lower sperm count, poorer sperm quality, and be more likely to develop testicular cancer. And that's the technical term for this condition is testicular dysgenesis syndrome. It happens in animals when a pregnant female is exposed to phthalates, a notorious endocrine disrupting compound. And the effects are seen in rats, mice, and humans. This is one of the best understood impact of endocrine disrupting compounds, with multiple lines of data from decades of research. And you can read all about it in Shauna's highly accessible, wonderful book. Hormones, let me advance the thing here. Hormones, the signals turn genes on and off. This is the symphony of life. It happens trillions of times a second throughout our lives, from the very beginning when an egg is fertilized all the way to old age and death. The hormone system, technically known as the endocrine system, produces hormones in specialized glands that are distributed throughout our bodies, tissues and cells, and then sent to target receptors also throughout the body. Proper hormone signaling, the symphony of life, is vital to whom we become as we grow up, mature, and age. It wires our brain correctly. It builds an immune system that works. It gives us strong muscles and bones. Literally all aspects of who we are biologically is controlled by the hormone system. So what do endocrine, so there's a hormone leaving the gland and going into the bloodstream, finding its target genes in the nucleus of a cell. And what that does, when the gene is turned on, it sends a message out into the cell body to create a protein. That's the bottom line of hormones. So what do endocrine disrupting compounds do? They hack the hormone system signals. They are endocrine disruptors. Some of them block the receipt of crucial signals, as I just described. Others mimic hormone signals. Sometimes that causes problems because it changes the timing of a needed signal. Imagine that you've got a mimic getting into the cell, and it adds to the signal as if there was it's kind of like a symphony orchestra in which there's an unplanned clash of cymbals, or there's a bigger signal and out of proportion to the other parts of the orchestra. Say that the horn section of an orchestra is drowning out the flutes. These are just two ways that EDCs hack the endocrine system. There are many more, which I don't have time to go into today. So where do EDCs come from? If we now know where hormones come from, how about EDCs? They come from the petrochemical system. Syngenta is one of many petrochemical companies that makes compounds, in their case, pesticides, that are endocrine disrupting compounds. Millions and millions of tons are made each year. Serious Science has identified over 1,000 chemicals in today's market that are EDCs. Many more are suspected. Most chemicals on the market today have never been tested for EDC effects. Now, EDCs are abundant in plastics for a variety of reasons. This is one of the most notorious of them, bisphenol A. This is an example of an EDC that is the monomer of the plastic, the backbone of the plastic molecule. Think of BPA as the brick in a wall of polycarbonate bound together by chemical bonds. So that's one way that a chemical can be that's one source of toxicity for a chemical. A second one is that additives are put into plastic to change the material characteristics of that plastic. In this case, it's PVC plastic plus a phthalate makes a squishy rubber duck. If that phthalate had not been added to the plastic, it would have been as hard as a rock. So there's a third source of toxicity in plastics, and they're called non-intentionally added substances, or NIAS. They come from impurities in the plastic. They come from reaction byproducts, and they also get in via air pollution. There are tens of thousands of NIAS in plastics, and there's very little information about toxicity. In fact, many of the NIAS, we don't even know what they are, but we know they're there because of peaks in various types of measurements. One of the problems is that these additives and NIAS are not bound to the plastic itself. They're infused into the plastic, or they get there by reactions. And then this is especially a problem in food packaging that's plastic. Plastic additives migrate from the plastic to the food, and from there into our stomachs. And from there, they can get into our tissues and fetuses where they can wreak hormonal chaos. So we don't know how many NIAS there are. We know they're there. We know that some of them are highly toxic, but we just haven't been able to work through the 10,000 or so that are there. What this terrible state of ignorance means is that you cannot assume any plastic is safe. You have to test it for safety. And recent studies report that the bio-based plastics that we are hearing things about, they can be just as bad as petrochemical plastics. If you don't test plastic materials for safety using 21st century biomedical science, you don't know what you have. If you take a random sample of plastics from consumer shelves, about 75% of them will show at least one toxic feature, some of which are endocrine disrupting. So you can't assume bioplastics are safe. We know that some are not. So I have studied EDCs for over 30 years ago. It began when I was working with Theo in the early 1990s. In 1991, I even gave them that name, endocrine disrupting chemicals. And in 1996, I co-authored this book with Theo and Diane Dumanowski. Since then, since that book was published, over $1 billion, euros, yen, and renminbi have been invested in EDC research. Tens of thousands of papers, scientific papers have been published in the peer-reviewed literature. We know orders of magnitude more now than we did in the early 1990s. And what we now know tells a factual scientific story much worse than we thought when we wrote that book, much worse. The ubiquity of EDCs in plastic and the abundance of plastic everywhere is a major part of why it is much worse. One important reality related to EDCs is that they have impacts at very low concentrations by the standards of traditional toxicology. That green bar is the range of impacts that most traditional toxicology studies, from low parts per million up to parts per thousand and parts per hundred. EDCs are much more like hormones in the ranges, the concentrations at which they work. Hormones definitely have big effects down to the low parts per trillion level, and EDCs go almost as far down and possibly as far down as hormones. We're still working on that. Why are we in this? Another thing about hormones and EDCs is their effects are amplified by intracellular machinery that can multiply the effect of the signals from hormones and EDCs by up to a factor of a million or more. So low doses, what seem to be low doses, can have big effects. And when you think about a part per billion, what is a part per billion? How can you think about it? Well, some friends of mine once calculated that it's one pancake in a stack of pancakes 4,000 miles high. That sounds like a tiny amount. But how many molecules of BPA are in this drop, this single drop, if its BPA concentration is 1 part per billion? How many molecules do you think are in that one drop? This might be a surprise, but it's 2.65 trillion molecules of BPA are in that one drop. And if you have a magnification and amplification process that takes one signal and multiplies it by a million or more, small amounts can cause big problems. Why are we in this situation? Well, there's a long history to this. We've written quite a bit about it in Environmental Health News. We're in this situation because of fatal flaws in how regulatory agencies today test for the harmful effects of endocrine disrupting compounds. I'll return to this later if I have time. Today's epidemics of chronic non-communicable diseases are linked clearly to EDCs through 3 streams of evidence, and they include hormone-related cancers, endometriosis, infertility, heart disease, a whole cluster of non-communicable pandemics that have hit the American public, the world public, in the last couple of decades. The studies, the research that backs that statement involve epidemiology, the study of the relationship between exposure and diseases in human, studies of how animals respond to EDCs in cages, and studies of how isolated tissues, cells, and cellular elements behave in response to EDCs. Here are some quick examples of human harm from EDCs. Oops. I mentioned this early on, right at the beginning. Shauna Swan's studies of sperm count decline initially in Western countries, but now in countries literally around the world. There's been something on the order of a 50% decline over 5 decades. Shauna has spent 3 decades trying to disprove this. She's a really superb scientist. She works to disprove her favorite hypotheses, and she can't make the signal go away. The slope remains virtually the same no matter how many controls she puts on the data. If you look at the current slope, and right now, the newest study came out in 2022, and it shows the decline starting to increase, so not decrease as we need. Would like to see it go flat, but if you just project these data down into the future, it looks like unless something is done to alter the situation, boys who are alive today as toddlers will find it increasingly difficult to have babies the old-fashioned way by 2045. So another effect of EDCs, very clearly established in the animal literature, it is rewiring brains in many different ways. And there's lots of epidemiology showing this, and also a lot of animal studies that confirm that process also. One expert in thyroid hormone disruption, and there are thyroid hormone disruptors in plastics. This scientist based in France has written that unless the long-term exponential increase in autism is stopped, by 2045, 1 in 2 children born in the US will be on the autism spectrum. That's shocking. And I know there are some extremely intelligent people with autism, but they're also, the cost for a family to have an autistic child in it is a lot to bear. So there's another effect that's clearly established, at least in animal testing. Have you ever wondered why so many aging men have trouble peeing? The only animal model that predicts this indicates it can result from BPA exposure in the womb. And what happens as the animal ages is that the urethra, which is the tube through which we pee, begins to constrict gradually over time until it's completely blocked. And in this case, here's an animal treated with 20 parts per billion BPA compared to the control in fetal life. Its bladder is about to explode. It will explode, except for this animal was sacrificed. Its kidneys have gone necrotic. And when this constriction of the urethra occurs in people, unless you have sufficient health insurance, it's basically a death sentence because it causes kidneys to go necrotic. A fourth example is a study out of Taiwan that found that a prominent phthalate used in IV bags and tubing interferes with standard treatment for breast cancer. So a woman has breast cancer, she's treated with medicine through IV bags and tubing, and it actually can counteract the treatment that's underway. Exposed women to these chemicals are more likely to relapse, and relapses are more likely to result in death. BPA and several other EDCs are linked to obesity and type 2 diabetes. The evidence is very strong from laboratory studies and epidemiological research. What this figure shows is a control animal on your left and the experimental animal on your right. The experimental animal was exposed to a EDC at 1 part per billion right after birth, and it becomes morbidly obese as it grows up. This is research from the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. So what would happen if it had been treated with 1,000 parts per billion instead of 1 part per billion? You think the mouse would have blown up because the dose is that much higher? Actually, it would have lost weight compared to the control. This is an example of how poorly regulatory science tests for dangers of EDC, because regulatory science always predicts, is structured around the expectation that higher doses are going to lead to bigger effects. And that's not what happens with endocrine disrupting compounds. Here's an example with BPA. And what would happen if the low dose experiments that scientists around the world have carried out, what would happen to what's considered the tolerable daily intake of BPA, that these scientists have found in studies what would happen if they used standard regulatory procedures to establish the current tolerable daily intake. That current, because the scientists have discovered BPA effects at low doses. Using these data from a long study funded by the National Institute of Environmental Sciences, the tolerable daily intake of BPA based on those low dose data would be reduced by a factor of 20,000. 20,000 would be the new tolerable daily intake. And just this year, the European Food Safety Authority, the counterpart to the FDA, which refuses to acknowledge low dose effects, the European Food Safety Authority agreed with these studies and recommend setting the tolerable daily intake down by a factor of 20,000 based on data different from what this set of data was taken from, 20,000 times lower. Here's a way to look at the FDA's approach to testing. So here we are, the scientists who did that research are using modern tools. They're using the Hubble, and the metaphor is the Hubble Space Telescope, or maybe even the Webb Space Telescope, and they can see things in the sky that you need those equipment for. Whereas the FDA is trying to find effects by using binoculars. That's how bad it is. So there are some hopeful things underway right now, which I can talk about, but we really now know we have to rethink how we use plastic and discover things that can be done without plastic. We have to redesign chemicals so they are inherently safer. And we know so much more now about EDC safety and what causes an EDC to be hazardous. We can begin to redesign them, but we've got to invest seriously in doing that. And lastly, we need to reform the approaches that agencies like the FDA take if you want inherently safer materials. So there is a path to the future of this child and her mother, if we think creatively and persistently about how to alter our use and design of chemicals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pete. That was incredibly sobering and very informative. Just one question before we move on to Judith's part of the presentation. I noticed that just today, the Washington Post had an article about the chronic disease rate in the United States and its impact on mortality, and that basically the life expectancy in the US is drifting down, even when you account for the opioid epidemic, even when you account for gun violence, the obvious factors within the American body public. In what way do you think endocrine disruption and this kind of chemical stew is implicated in that downward drift?
Well, I read that article too, and I look at it and I said, endocrine disruption is shouting at me. Because they talked about what the factors contributing to the higher mortality rate is. It's heart disease. We know endocrine disruption, BPA specifically, and others can cause heart disease. It talked about diabetes and obesity, and I mentioned those here because the science is very clear. Some endocrine disruptors, which are now called obesogens because they cause obesity, it's just got endocrine disruption written all over it, but the article did not mention this.
Thank you.
But I actually sent it around to my staff so they would get yet another reason to increase the urgency of our work.
Yeah, that article made the public health rounds all over the country today, I think. I received it several times myself. I think we can shift gears though, because we're moving into possibilities for regulatory action, which Senator Harckham has blessedly brought to the floor. And Judith is in an excellent position to explain to us. I see in the chat, people are already clamoring for suggestions, solutions beyond their own individual actions, because their individual actions are not very effective in a world that's so awash with plastics that can't be avoided. So Judith, please tell us about Senator Harckham's bill and how this can affect the situation.
Sure, and thank you, Dr. Myers, for that brilliant overview. And now the question is, Dr. Wolff poses, what do we do with it? There's a lot we can do, and I'm a former federal regulator, so of course I'm going to say, let's adopt a new law and have strong regulations to enforce those laws. And we just happen to have a really good bill pending in the New York State Legislature that I want to talk to you about. And if you're thinking, oh, that's great, but I don't live in New York, you too can get this bill introduced in your state legislature. And it's a wonderful model on how we can start moving in a different direction. I'm talking about the Packaging Reduction and Recycling Infrastructure Act. It's in the Senate in New York, Senate Bill 4246A by Senator Harckham. We'll share the full bill with you. And it's sponsored in the Assembly, Assembly Bill 5322A by Assemblymember Glick. What you need to know about Senator Harckham and Assemblywoman Glick is, first, they're wonderful people. They're very dedicated public servants, and they are the brand new chairs of the Environmental Committee in both houses. And so they have arrived in these leadership positions right when we need them, because New York and other states are drowning in excess single-use plastic packaging. In New York, 40% of the state's waste is packaging. I'll talk about those environmental impacts, but there's also enormous financial impacts associated with single-use packaging. This bill should be very appealing to fiscal conservatives. New York City alone spends $432 million every single year sending its solid waste out of state or to the Finger Lakes in upstate New York, where it's buried in a landfill or burned in a garbage incinerator. One of the places New York City's waste goes is to the Newark, New Jersey Covanta garbage incinerator, which is located in a low-income community of color in the wonderful section of Newark called Ironbound. That incinerator has been polluting in the city of Newark for decades, and it's expensive for New York City taxpayers. We know about the enormous environmental impacts of plastic pollution. It's an environmental justice issue because plastics are typically manufactured in low-income communities of color in Louisiana, Texas, and Appalachia. There's actually a stretch along the Mississippi River in Louisiana called Cancer Alley because of the high rates of cancer in that area where there's such a concentration of petrochemical plants, a lot of that making plastic. Plastics is an ocean issue. Millions of metric tons of plastic enter the ocean every year. We are turning our ocean into a plastic landfill. Plastic is a climate change issue. Our organization Beyond Plastics did a report, Plastics is the New Coal. By 2030, there will be more greenhouse gas emissions from the production, use, and disposal of plastics than from coal-fired power plants. And you certainly heard tonight the health impacts. I teach a class on plastic pollution through Bennington College, and it's taught online, so people all over the country can take the class. The next time it's offered is next semester, April and May. Wednesday nights on Zoom. Wednesday nights have never been the same since. And as I go through all of the concerns about plastic, inevitably there are students who are raising their hands and saying, well, can't we just recycle more plastic? And I feel like I'm telling people there is no Santa Claus, because we cannot recycle our way out of the plastic pollution problem. Plastic recycling is at an abysmal 5 to 6% recycling rate. So what are we going to do? Well, one thing is to pass this model packaging reduction law. And let me rapidly walk you through some of the key provisions. You know how we have fuel efficiency standards for cars that came out of the Federal Clean Air Act and good EPA regulations? And now automobiles get much better fuel efficiency. And that means you and I spend less at the pump than we did even 5 years ago. We have appliance efficiency standards for our refrigerator and our ovens. Appliances have gotten more energy efficient because of these appliance efficiency standards. What this legislation does is provide us with environmental standards for packaging. It's overdue. This legislation would require a 50% reduction in plastic packaging over 12 years. And one thing I've learned from my various internships in state and federal government is it's not responsible to have a long-term aspirational goal, like we're going to reduce plastics by 50% by 2050 or something like that. We need short-term goals and they need to be incremental. So what Senator Harckham and Assemblymember Glick's bill does is require a 10% reduction in plastic packaging by year 3, 20% reduction by year 5, 30% by year 8, 40% by year 10, and 50% by year 12. This gives businesses enough time to make the transition away from plastics. And because it's incremental, if businesses are not meeting the targets, you can adjust. After you reduce, which could be just by physically reducing the size of the packaging or refillable containers or reusables, after you do that, the rest of the packaging must be recyclable, meaning really recyclable. Second key provision, and can we please put this up on the screen? This bill would require a reduction in toxics in packaging. We identified about 15 of the most toxic chemicals found in consumer packaging. So within 2 years after the promulgation of new regulations, none of these toxic chemicals can appear in packaging in the state. Bisphenols, PFAS chemicals, forever chemicals, lead, antimony compounds, carbon black, perchlorate, formaldehyde, etc. I would love to have a debate with the American Chemistry Council and have them defend why they need formaldehyde in consumer packaging. I don't think they can defend that. And now it's time for policymakers to get toxics out of packaging. Third key provision is no plastic burning, aka chemical recycling or advanced recycling. The plastics industry is finally acknowledging that conventional recycling of plastics hasn't worked. So they've now shifted to what they call advanced recycling, which is really just using high heat or chemicals to deal with waste plastic, mostly to create fossil fuels or synth fuels, the last thing we need. Fourth, this legislation should include a modernized bottle bill or beverage deposit law, mandatory deposits on beverage containers to boost recycling, reduce litter, and create income for low-income folks who are collecting empty containers. 5, we need to provide some financial relief to taxpayers and consumers. So this bill has a modest fee on packaging. The more environmentally destructive your packaging is, the higher the fee you pay. So if it's refillable or reusable packaging, you don't pay a fee. And where does that money go? Not to the general fund. It goes to local governments to fund waste reduction, reuse, refill programs, like installing public water fountains all over your main street, by giving schools money to install dishwashing equipment for cafeterias rather than students being served breakfast and lunch on single-use plastic packaging. And then, of course, to help fund recycling. 6, we want to cover both residential waste and commercial waste. What I'm talking about used to be known as extended producer responsibility, EPR. That typically only covered residential waste. Number 7, avoid glaring loopholes. 4 states in the US have already adopted extended producer responsibility laws: Maine, Colorado, Oregon, and California. The California law has a deeply troubling loophole. Section 42060 of the California EPR law exempts, quote, single-use material that presents unique challenges in compliance. Let me read that to you again. Single-use material that presents unique challenges in compliance. Who would put that phrase into a statute? I can guess. This is what happens when bills are negotiated in the middle of the night with no public transparency. Number 8, don't put the packaging industry in charge. And that's how a lot of these programs work. We want strong oversight and accountability, and we want transparency and inclusion in the process. Is this going to solve the entire plastics problem? No, but it will really make a significant reduction in plastic packaging, and it is worthy of your active support. This is a David and Goliath fight. It is opposed by the chemical industry, big consumer brand products, the fossil fuel industry, the plastics industry, but we have people power on our side, and we have the facts on our side. And we're going to take Dr. Pete Meyer's PowerPoint tonight and bring it into meetings and explain why we have to reduce toxics in packaging. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Judith. I'm gonna start with the first question here. So I have that privilege as the moderator. I'm thinking about the fact that single-use plastics and packaging make up 40% of plastics. So one might expect that our lawmakers would be on board for the Packaging Reduction and Recycling Act. What do you see as the main obstacles to passing your strong packaging reduction bill in the next legislative session?
Well, it's what I just referenced. There is a cottage industry of lobbyists that go around the country opposing laws like this. And they're very shrewd. They know that the public is concerned about plastic pollution and packaging, and they know that lawmakers want to do something. So they often show up with really weak bills filled with loopholes, like the one I just read. Really weak bills that would allow for chemical recycling, and basically urging lawmakers to pass something, anything, the details don't really matter, and then it kind of freezes opportunities for substantial change. So we are up against a lot of special interest opposition. Something really exciting about the New York bill is it has 34 co-sponsors in the state Senate, which is a majority of the senators, and 72 co-sponsors in the Assembly. And that's because ordinary citizens around the state are neglecting their children in the evening and making phone calls and writing letters to the editor. Ordinary citizens are really working hard on this, and this is why I'm really hopeful that we can push past the opposition of the special interests.
So I would hesitate to disagree with Judith about anything, but I would disagree with calling it a cottage industry. It's a Goliath industry.
Yes,
it's incredibly powerful and focused, and it's a hard fight.
Well, when it does pass, we're going to look at this from the optimism that we can marshal here. When it does pass, what impact will it have on national initiatives?
I think it'll be a model. I'm not optimistic that we're going to get much through this Congress. My parents, Helen and Sonny Ank, named me after St. Jude, the patron saint of lost causes. And I'm not even going to try this bill at the federal level. But what we're going to do is pass it in a bunch of states, and then it'll trickle up. That's how a lot of good environmental policy is made these days, since we no longer appear to have a functioning democracy in Washington, D.C.
And on that comment, I would agree 100%.
It's an advocacy question for Pete. How aware do you think general practitioners are about the impacts or potential impacts of plastic and endocrine disruptors are on health? And how might we be able to work with them to help promote further knowledge and advocacy?
That's a great question. And the answer is a little complicated, but it comes down to how old you are as a physician. If you entered the practice of medicine before all this information started to come out, you're probably pretty ignorant of it. But if you're, for example, you were having a family after we began to understand all that, younger physicians of all stripes really get what this problem is. They know what bisphenol A is, they know what phthalates are, they advise their patients about things. But unfortunately, the power structure in medicine gives the power to people who've been around a long time, and they are largely ignorant. So it's an age thing. And there's a famous quote from a physicist on changes in ideas and how you win, how you can win a generational debate like that. Basically, you have to wait until your opponents die. That sounds a little crude, but by and large, with some exceptions, the Endocrine Society, which is composed of scientists and endocrinologists, practicing endocrinologists, the Endocrine Society, 70% of the members of the Endocrine Society are practicing physicians. They get this 100%. They are adamantly involved in efforts to change policies in the US. They actually also have a global task force that I've been working with for years, which has achieved dramatic changes in European approaches to policy on these things. So, and why do they get it? Because their offices are filled with patients who are suffering from endocrine-related diseases, like in the article you mentioned. Endocrinologists understand that doing this as it has been done over the last 50 years is not going to work. It's going to make their practice much harder. And so the Endocrine Society has formal policies on endocrine disruption. And I urge all of you to check them out. It's the world's largest professional association of endocrinologists.
Okay, high credibility allies.
Yeah,
Judith, you have, sorry. Judith, you have the world's largest rubber ducky on your desk right now. I couldn't help but notice that you picked it up. I'm wondering what you wanted to.
I have that too.
I want to mention the duck for a moment, and I didn't buy this. I actually borrowed it from my friend's grandchildren, and they're upset they don't have it anymore, and I have no shame. This is on loan. This duck is made from a plastic called PVC plastic, polyvinyl chloride. PVC plastic is made from this chemical that was implicated in the terrible toxic train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio in February. As you may recall, a Norfolk Southern train derailed in East Palestine, Ohio, right near the Pennsylvania border. What typically would have happened is after the immediate emergency, EPA would have removed the vinyl chloride from the train cars and brought it to a commercial hazardous waste disposal facility. Instead, someone made the decision to drain the 5 train cars, literally just punch holes in the bottom of the metal cars, drain the vinyl chloride into ditches, and then purposely set it on fire. And then, not surprisingly, this iconic black plume went over the community. And we know when you burn vinyl chloride, you get dioxins and other contaminants. This issue has faded a little bit from the public eye, but I think people need to know that people in East Palestine are still suffering. We are very fortunate at Beyond Plastics. We just hired Jessica Connor, who is a resident of East Palestine, who has spoken out. And she wanted to come work for Beyond Plastics because of the connection between how her community is suffering and how it's connected to plastic. So 99% of vinyl chloride used to make PVC plastic. And what I'm concerned about is the World Economic Forum says that in the next 20 years, plastic production will double. That means we will see more and more toxic chemicals being transported on our nation's rickety rail system. So when I went to EPA to meet with them this summer, I brought the duck and said, there are alternatives to PVC plastic, and EPA has the authority to ban vinyl chloride under the Toxic Substance Control Act, and they will be deciding within the next few months whether or not to start the process to ban or restrict vinyl chloride. So I want to just quickly urge everyone when we're done here to go to beyondplastics.org and please sign our petition to the EPA, urging them to start the process to restrict vinyl chloride.
Let me second Judith's comments there and add a little bit to it. It's another intersection between climate and plastics. And that intersection is, think of the amount of PVC plastic that's in houses today. Houses in areas that are burning because of forest fires. That is sending a plume of smoke over residential areas that have dioxins in them. And it's because of the widespread use of PVC plastic in building. That has to be banned.
And it's in packaging. I failed to mention the Harckham Glick bill would prohibit PVC plastic in packaging. The industry says they're going to stop using PVC plastic in packaging, but they haven't.
There's a lot of things they say they're going to do that they then don't. And we have to hold their feet to the fire.
Or pass a law requiring it so their promises are honored. And thank you, Andrew. We just popped the toxic vinyl chloride petition into the chat. Please sign it and then send it to 10 of your best friends and family members and ask them to sign it quick.
Thanks, Pete and Judith. We're right at time. I know we could go on with questions, frankly, all night. A good friend of mine once said after a political election that didn't go the way we'd hoped, it's going to get a whole lot worse before it gets worse, which is often how I feel as I study plastic. But the thing is that we have so much power to change this, not necessarily because we need to wait for a cohort to die, although there is a reality there that, you know, some people who are not well educated are not going to take up the banner, but we can. There are 450 people on this webinar tonight and many more who are going to see this recording. And as people learn about these issues, they want to talk about them and they want to take action. To know this is to want to take action. So I want to urge everybody who's joined us tonight and everyone who's watching it as a recording or an email forward or however you get it, to stay with us at Beyond Plastics, at the League of Women Voters, to keep your ear to the floor. Listen to the podcasts that come out about the health effects of plastics because they're growing and growing and growing. People are paying more and more attention to this, particularly as we begin to understand that microplastics are also part of our lives and our bodies. So we're finding out more all the time. But you have a channel here, a direct channel to more information as it comes out. Judith is a gift in terms of her policy compass and understanding what we can do on the regulatory level, not just the individual level, to really affect change. And researchers like Pete are amazingly important in finding out, in turning over those rocks, and in coining the kinds of language that we need to be able to talk about all of this. So I'll hand it over to Judith, and then we'll conclude.
I think you said that beautifully. I want to thank Beth Radow and her colleagues at the League of Women Voters for having this idea, our other co-sponsors. I didn't mean to raise my hand, actually. I was trying to do a round of applause. Let me also thank Dr. Pete Myers and my colleague at Beyond Plastics, Dr. Megan Wolff. We have a lot of questions. The questions that were asked were mostly ones that were submitted in advance. But as Megan said, stay with us at beyondplastics.org. Lots of good information, future webinars, and I wish you all good health and good night.